My name's Anne Chapman. I'm a director of Greenhouse think tank. So I'd like to welcome everybody here today, and apologies for the fact that it's a wonderful sunny day outside and we're in this room with no natural light. But I hope you find it an interesting and stimulating day and can we make up for your lack of sunshine. Just a few things to say about Greenhouse. We're a think tank that was set up in 2011 by a small group of people. So we're UK-based. We basically publish reports and books and organise events to try and develop green thinking in the UK, and perhaps to say things that other people or other organisations can't, that are campaigning organisations or political parties. So you can see a selection of some of our output on the stall over there. Our latest book, which I meant to bring up and wave, is called Facing Up to Climate Reality. That was published in March. Oh, look, Jonathan's waving it. And so that is... so that's available for sale, discount price £10 today. There's also our previous book, The Post-Growth Project, a few copies of that as well. That's also £10. This is part of our Climate Jobs Project, which is work that we've been doing for a few years now, supported by and with the Green European Foundation. And Natalie is going to introduce that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to... Can we have the next slide? I just wanted to, while I've got the floor and able to say something. Today we're going to hear a lot about how to reduce our emissions. And a while ago I read Mike Berners-Lee's book, There's No Planet B, and then his previous book, The Burning Question. And I thought I'd just show this. He talks about, this is my poor quality scan of it. One way to think about all this is to imagine the extraction of combustion of fossil fuels and the carbon footprint of the world's consumers as being coupled together like the carriage of a train. So this, in a way, explains why, despite all the efforts to reduce emissions and the achievements in reducing emissions in particular places, the world's carbon emissions are still going up and the consumption of fossil fuels is still going up. Because there's also this push factor from extraction. So you might reduce your consumption, but there's a push factor that it just means it gets burnt elsewhere. So I'd like us always to remember that we also need to stop taking fossil fuels out the ground. And Mike Berners-Lee says that, the real answer is to get a global deal on stopping fossil fuel extraction in line with carbon budgets. And but what we do on reducing emissions is still important, because I think that makes it more politically possible to be able to then live without fossil fuels, and makes that global deal more likely. So that's all I've got to say, I think, because I have a load of notes, but I can't find them. Apart from introducing, no, it's not in there, introducing Natalie Bennett, who's going to chair the rest of this session. And so you probably mainly know Natalie from the leader of the Green Party at the time of the 2015 election. But she's really here in her role as a director of the Green European Foundation, which she'll tell you all about. But in the last week, she's been made Baroness of Manor Castle. Yeah, I looked it up and wrote it down, and so congratulations. And I'm now going to hand over to her, and she's going to introduce the speakers this session.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here and to have had a reminder that that book on facing up to the climate emergency, I got a copy that I was supposed to write a review of about 3 months ago. I'll give you the short version. It's very good and well worth reading. So that's the short review of that. Now, I am here a week or so after my new membership of the House of Lords was announced. I'm being asked a lot, what do you call me? It's very easy. Natalie. That's what you call me, just like you did before. I'm thinking of instituting, a rule. People often have swear jars. When, if you're in the office and you swear, you have to pay a fine. any signs of undue deference are going to be £1 to charity. Right? Everyone got that? You're allowed one joke. One joke's fine, and after that, I'm just Natalie. Right. And the other thing perhaps is worth saying, I had a piece in the Yorkshire Post. Why am I in the House of Lords? I'm there to abolish my own job as soon as possible. That's the aim. But this is not why I'm actually here this morning. As was said, I'm wearing one of my many other hats, which is as a member of the board of the Green European Foundation. Now, this is basically the umbrella group for think tanks, green think tanks, most of which are linked in one way or another to green parties right across Europe. That means there's a very broad range from the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Germany, which gets lots and lots and lots of government money, because there they think that politics and research and political research might actually need to be funded. And I must admit that I've introduced crowdfunding into the Green European Foundation, and the Germans have really found that idea very shocking, because they just expect the government should pay for this, and they find it really uncomfortable to go and ask people for money. Now, Jeff has a number of projects and has been in line with the Green Wave, with the results of the European election that we've just had. Jeff has been growing significantly and developing. I've been involved with it for about 5 years. And one of the things I'd like to point you to is the Green European Journal, which you'll find online. And, I've got quite a few articles in it, but that's not why I'm saying it's very good, because there's a whole lot of really interesting thinking in there. And I was just talking, actually, this week I was in Brussels at a Jeff meeting, and we were talking about how we translate many things from English. If you write for the Green European Journal, you might end up being translated into Hungarian or Polish. And we've got a really big focus on making sure that we can take some of the thinking that's been developed in particularly the north and the west of Europe and transfer it to the east and the south. But what we also try and do, and what I think is terribly important, is we also take things from Polish and Hungarian and Finnish and all kinds of other languages and translate them into English. So this isn't simply a one-way exchange. Now, one of the ways that Jeff works particularly is what's known as transnational projects. So these are projects where a number of think tanks from different nations across Europe are involved, which this project we're in today is one of those. And I think that's really crucial of just sharing, because one of my things, even before I got involved in politics, one of my pet subjects is let's try not to reinvent the wheel. Let's try and start to the point others have got to and move on. So that means not starting from scratch, but seeing what else is out there. And that's one of the key things that Jeff tries to do. Another thing that we're just starting to do is Jeff has started to develop its own projects on particular subjects. And one of these that I've been involved in is the Universal Basic Income Project, which very much started from a transnational project, but is now being taken on by Jeff on its own because it's so important. And one of the things, just if I can mention my own personal interest here, we don't currently have a Green Party-linked green think tank in Scotland. And I'd very much like to see one start. So anyone who has any thoughts or links on that, please come and talk to me. And I think we're going to hold, this year, we'll be holding a Universal Basic Income event in Scotland that I hope will help make that happen. What we're also doing coming up is what I think is a really important project on climate refugees. Because this is an issue that I think we know what the other side, the hideous far right, say, which is, let's build the walls and keep them out. We've tended to say, well, we have to make sure we can provide them refuge, which is true, but let's think more sophisticatedly, let's think about broader issues around that. One of the things, I went to a meeting with academics, and one of the things we have to think about in the age of climate emergency, how not being able to move is actually a huge problem. Everyone tends to think of being forced to move or people moving as a problem. But for some people, not being able to move is going to be literally deadly. And that's something we've really got to think about that really hasn't been thought about very much. So Jeff is really much moving into starting to look at where there's gaps in thinking, where we can put a little bit of resources in and fill some gaps. So that's a very brief introduction to Jeff. If you'd like to find out more, please come and talk to me later. I'll be round all day. I'm about to do my chairing bit, but I'm just going to start with one thought, if I may, from the chair, which is I'm really excited to be here and pleased to be here because, understandably, a lot of what we hear talking about the climate emergency now is talking about how dangerous and threatening and worrying, disastrous it is. And of course, all of those things are absolutely true. But it's also crucial that we focus on the fact that we have been trashing the planet, not just climate change, but soils and water and plastics and everything else, and creating a thoroughly miserable society at the same time, a desperately unequal society with huge epidemics of mental ill health, huge amounts of stress and insecurity. And so the fact that we've got to change for the climate emergency and all these other environmental planetary limits we're running up against is actually good news, because in doing that we can build a much better society. So, I will warn the speakers who are coming after me, though I'm sure they won't do this. Anyone who gets too depressing, I may have a too depressing klaxon that goes, let's focus on the positives, because what we're talking about today is how we do things to tackle the climate emergency, but also how we build a better society. And those two things have to go together. The Green Movement had always said that economic and environmental justice are indivisible. And that's really what we're talking about, addressing both sides of that today. So, okay, I'm going to stop abusing my chair's privileges now and put my glasses back on, because I've reached that age where I really have to have glasses on to read bits of paper. And introduced our first speaker, who pretty well comes into that category of needing no introduction, but, I'll do it anyway, because actually he's developed a whole new set of titles since I last introduced him at something or other. So Andrew Sims is the coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance, an author, political economist and activist. He's the co-director of the New Weather Institute, assistant director of Scientists for Global Responsibility, a research associate at the University of Sussex, and a fellow of the New Economics Foundation. And I'm just going to, before Andrew comes up, share one memory from many years ago now. I spoke at an event that Jean Lambert, the former MEP for London, ran, and Andrew talked a lot. I think it was Madagascan basking beetles, or something like it. It was about Namibian basking beetles. There you go. So I definitely remembered it, even if I didn't get all the details right. So Andrew was always worth listening to. So I hand you over to Andrew.
Yeah, and to be precise, it was the Namibian fog basking beetle. It's got this kind of brilliant trick that they've learnt from in very arid zones about how you can kind of grow food. Because what the Namibian fog basking beetle does, as its name suggests, is during the night it goes up onto sort of a high duney points, and it raises its wings in such a way that as dawn comes up and the water condenses, little droplets of water collect on its wings. Then it tips them up and drinks the water, and they use that to develop a kind of greenhouse which enabled you to kind of grow food. So that was the Namibian. Give it up for the Namibian fog basking beetle, ladies and gentlemen. Put my pen down. And as Natalie was speaking, she started talking about Jeff, and I thought, who's Jeff? I haven't heard of Jeff. I didn't know Jeff was speaking. Acronym, Jeff. So if you're up for funding that kind of work, as you were speaking, never being one to miss an opportunity, about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, when we were at NEF, we actually published a report called Environmental Refugees, The Case for Recognition. We'd love to do an update, just saying. And it's really nice arriving here as well. I'd never been to this church before. And I kind of walked in the front. I thought, oh, look, this beautiful daylight, glass walls. And then they said, oh, yeah, you're in the basement. And as it was a church, as I was walking here, one of my favourite little quotes says, a French theologian called Blaise Pascal, who said famously that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly alone in a room. So I don't know what you're doing here. Are you part of the problem? Are you part of the solution? In fact, I don't know what you're doing here, because if you believe what you read at the moment, the oil companies have got it in hand. Didn't you know they're part of the solution? BP and Shell and Co. And I bet all their senior management teams right now on this beautiful sunny day are sitting in the basement of a church somewhere in London trying to sort out the problem. Don't you think? You can go home. It's okay. The good news is, I think, that people are trying to do stuff. And I came back by train yesterday from Bruges, beautiful city in Belgium. and I've been talking at an event which was about sustainable tourism. And there were lots of really nice little things going on. Community organised projects, and they were seeing themselves as part of the experience economy that can help us shift from the commodified economy. So there was lots of good things going on, but the thing which emerged over the course of the day and a half spent there, one by one as you spoke to people, you realised that, you know, half of the people there had flown halfway around the world to get there. And when you talk to them, they were kind of a bit apologetic about it, but everybody had a reason. Everybody had an excuse. And one of the things that struck me is that even when you get in a group of people who are well-meaning and who are thinking about these things, we're locked in. We've got this path dependency. Our choices occur within an infrastructure over which we had no influence in its design. And that's where the problem comes, when you get to the point of wanting to fundamentally change the so-called choice architecture within we make our decisions. So it's all very well talking about behavior change, and behavior change is incredibly important. But the moment you step outside of the close-knit circle of the really dedicated activist, people's choices are being set in ways in which the default position is to keep doing things as we've always done them. The inertia in the system is what we have to overcome. And so in that little Blaise Pascal quote about humanity's problems, well, we kind of know, Natalie's mentioned what the problems are, just to put a kind of a number on them. One of the recent reports on 1.5 degree lifestyles, kind of roughly, and this is looking at a global average, and of course things have to change much more quickly in countries like the UK, but we're looking at getting the per capita emissions globally down to about 2.5 tons CO2e by 2030, 1.4 by 2040, 0.7 by 2050 if we want to keep to 1.5. What does that mean in a UK context? Well, probably quite a few of you would have seen Tim Jackson's latest. His numbers are that we need to get to 95% reductions by 2030. We all know, however you look at it, that it is rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented change in all areas of society, to use the IPCC's phrase. Now, the good thing, of course, is we now know there's increasingly a popular mandate for change. The last time I looked at the figure, it's probably changed since then. At the end of last month, 985 jurisdictions in 18 countries having declared a climate emergency. And yet, to use a phrase which has been so resonant that I've seen it attributed to at least half a dozen different people, it's still easier to imagine the end of the world than a fundamental change to our economic system. And one of the ways that you see that, and the sanguine nature of the mainstream, is that even years after the financial crisis, just a few years ago, the Wall Street Journal felt able to publish a book which it called The Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing in the Apocalypse. It's a real book, published by a relatively respectable publisher. You can buy it online. And when you read it, you think, oh, they're being ironic. Actually, they're not being ironic. They really are assuming that it's all going to fall apart, and point out a few ways in which the already extremely wealthy can become even more extremely wealthy. So here's our challenge. Can we imagine the circumstances in which the phase shift, the paradigm shift, the huge jump in the infrastructures within which we work can change? And I think there's a little secret. And it's one of the things which gives me abiding hope. And I think that is that we are far, far better at adapting to change, and far more resilient than all the popular narratives give credit for. And one of the reasons I think that is because I live in South London, and I live under the flight path of planes coming into Heathrow. And a few years ago, it was back in 2010, I woke up one morning. You know, sometimes when you wake up and something's different, you can't quite put your finger on it. I thought, what's different? And what was different was that morning I couldn't hear any planes flying overhead. I thought, hello? Aye, what's going on? So I turned the radio on. It was the trusty Radio 4. And somewhere a long way away, further north, in a cold place, a volcano had erupted. A volcano called Eyjafjallajökull. Thank you. And thank you. And because of the very fine particulate matter, the particular geology of where it erupted, it's got up into the airstream and it put a type of particulate matter into the airstream which is lethal to modern jet engines, which meant that almost instantly and overnight, the aviation industry was switched to off. And for 4 days, nothing flew in Northern Europe, across Europe. No flights from North America. And this was something that we'd come to take for granted. It was one of the modern arteries of the global economy, and suddenly it wasn't available. So, of course, what was going to happen was that, quite literally, the sky would fall on our heads and everything would fall apart, wouldn't it? But no, that isn't what happened. Because what happened was, in the savvy modern world, people turned to social media, and they car shared, and they sofa surfed. And the supermarkets that got into the habit of flying in their luxury horticulture from West Africa and other places turned to local suppliers who instead provided seasonal local produce. Business people who would have been flying to meetings turned to video conferencing. There was a sudden spike up in video conferencing. The Norwegian Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, who was stuck in the UN in New York, ran his parliament from his iPad. So something, which is obviously one of the most polluting ways in which we get around in the world, suddenly wasn't available. And what happened? The world reorganized itself. We adapted. So I believe we're a lot better at change, and that there's probably more slack in the system than we give ourselves credit for. And when we think about these big phase shifts, these big changes in infrastructure that enable us to do things, transport is a great one to dwell upon, because talking about the time frames in which we need to make these changes, if you think back to the middle of the 19th century, there was a 7-year period in the middle of the 19th century when Britain rolled out nearly 4,500 miles of railway. You know, at the time, slightly ironically, it was seen as the great beast. It was the sort of thing that perhaps the people in this room might have been campaigning against. Today, of course, we see it as the environmental alternative. On a single weekend, in 1892, the Great Western Route had to upgauge its rail. Now, cast away your memories of what happened more recently on the East Coast Main Line, the years of delay, the billions over budget. Back in 1892, in a single weekend in May, they started work at dawn on Saturday morning and worked through to dawn on the following Monday morning and reopened the line, nearly 180 miles of track. We have the ability to do the most extraordinary things when we try. Now, we're talking a lot about, and we'll be talking a lot about the Green New Deal, and also I can give you a little secret heads up. Next week, there's going to be a new version of the Green New Deal announced, and there's going to be a bill, which is not going to be called the Green New Deal bill, because the clerk's office wouldn't let us do that, but it's got a long title with the word decarbonisation in it, and it is the Green New Deal bill, will be announced. So watch out for that one. But if you leap forward in time, obviously, where did we get the name from? We got the name from another moment in which, in the shadow of a failed economic system, extraordinary changes were achieved, and that was the original New Deal. Now, Roosevelt gave us that line, that benchmark by which all new political administrations are judged, the idea of the 100 days. And he did incredible things in his 100 days. If you think of the difficulty that Barack Obama had in getting through a single bill, in Roosevelt's first 100 days, he got through 15 bills. We had the new re-regulation of finance and banking, the Glass-Steagall Act. We had a rural relief program, public works programs, the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the creation of 250,000 jobs in national parks and forests. Moments like that reveal all kinds of potentialities. Think back to just a decade ago, the time of the financial crisis itself, 2007, 2008. Things which even months before would have been unthinkable saw economic policies the likes of which were previously unimagined, like, for example, the de facto nationalisation of our high street banks. It's really bizarre. The one thing I really find hard to get my head around, the kind of the shortness of memory, you know, that bit when we were told that there's no kind of magic money tree. It's like, what was quantitative easing that we used to bail out the banks? Hundreds of billions injected into the economy. Now, that was actually done very badly. That money tended to wash through the system in such a way that just led to luxury asset price inflation. But imagine what we'd have done if we'd used that tool to invest in the low-carbon transition of the UK, where we would be today had we not done that. There are other things other great opportunities which revealed themselves almost accidentally at that time. And I really like the fact that under a Republican governor in Utah in the States, because the municipality looked like it was going to go broke, he put all the non-emergency public workers onto a 4-day week, and they had the presence of mind to look at the impact of moving onto a 4-day week. Now, I personally think that a combination of some form of universal basic income and a shorter working week are two of the most innovative measures which will create the space for us to deliver on this transition. Now, in Utah, they had the presence of mind to study the impact of shifting to the 4-day week, and what they found was, perhaps unsurprisingly to this constituency, that staff morale went up, absenteeism went down, people reported better home lives. A third of the public said that access to services had got better because they carefully thought through how to work around the different hours. And even though it wasn't designed to be part of it, emissions in a 6-month period went down 14% because they were mothballing their vehicle fleet and closing buildings. Big things happen when these opportunities emerge. There's other great changes, of course, because we need the big cultural shifts. We all know that being surrounded by advertising has a really bad reinforcing impact on us self-identifying as consumers. It undermines our well-being. We know that children exposed to advertising find it more difficult to develop relationships and have their own well-being undermined. And yet there are places around the world, ranging from Sao Paulo in Brazil to Grenoble in France to Chennai in India, that are starting to clean away the visual pollution, the paint pot of excessive consumerism and materialism that keep us locked into that consumption train that we saw earlier. Stuff is changing. A bit of cultural self-medication is going on. From the first one that opened in Amsterdam in 2009, as of last year, there were about 1,800 repair cafes. There's changes in models of governance and ownership of our fundamental assets, the really important ones in a warming world like water, the remunicipalization of water. There were 2 instances of that in 2000, 235 in 2015. Divestment from fossil fuels, the first conscious act of divestment by a financial institution was in 2012. There was the 1,000th in 2018. Natalie mentioned this idea about how we need some sort of treaty to prevent further exploration and extraction. Well, very conveniently, we have one in our back pocket. We published one at the end of last year called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I can give you the link to the journal article. It was inspired by the fact that last year was the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There seems to be an unenviable logic for it. And now, of course, from America to across Europe and in the UK, we have the policy vehicle through which we can deliver these kind of changes at speed. And that is the Green New Deal. And I think we all need to put our weight and energy behind those. So just to kind of round up, I think the message I want to leave is one of the biggest problems in this movement has always been, can we display, can we feel, can we experience the same kind of bulletproof self-confidence that the bastards who got us into this mess in the first place have always had, and have had the audacity to use the evidence of their failed economic model to push that very model even harder? Can we have the courage, the hope, the belief, and the confidence to push our solutions as much as they have pushed theirs? And I would say, look around, just look at the evidence of the last few decades about some of the behavioural shifts that there have been. Look in areas which we haven't always connected to the climate debate, like in public health. Look at the fact that, just a few decades ago, half the population in Britain smoked. Now it's less than 1 in 5. Look at changing attitudes to drink driving. Look at the way that we turned around another potentially apocalyptic health scare around HIV and AIDS. Look at the fact that now car-free days, there were none in the year 2000. There's over 2,000 of them now, and they're all around the world. Jakarta has a car-free day every year. Look at the fact that not 2 or 3 years ago, the vegans were still objects of humour in British society. Oh, how they're having the last laugh now. When Greggs thought it was having a bit of a PR laugh, bringing in the vegan sausage roll, and then was embarrassed because within days they couldn't keep up with demand. And look at how all the other food manufacturers are doing the same thing now. Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, the vegans have landed, and I'm really happy that they have. And that potential for change, just to kind of round off with the last note, I started off talking about kind of flying and the problem with flying. And flying, as we all know, in any given year, I think the best estimate is that only about 2 or 3% of the world's population fly at all. It is a problem of luxury lifestyles. And when our great heroine of the moment, Greta Thunberg, chose, when she came to speak at the British Parliament, because they finally decided that they'd talk about climate change after a few years, when she came over and she very, very publicly took the train, in the 4 months after that in Sweden, the number of people taking flights in Sweden fell by 8%. Now, in industry terms, that's a shock. The number of people taking the train went up 8%. And as is now law and legion, the Swedes have a word for it. Flygskam, flight shame. But they also have a word for what it is when you self-consciously take the train. They call it tagskritt. It's like train brag. And did I mention that when I went to Bruges, I took the train? Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and not focused on beetles this time, but some foreign perspectives there as well. So good to see. So our next speaker, I think, flows on very well from this, because we've talked a little about not being pessimistic, not focusing on bad things, and we're going to talk a little about how we take an alternative approach. So Nadine Andrews is a psychosocial researcher and mindfulness and nature-based coach, consultant and trainer. She works as a senior social researcher in the Scottish Government and is a visiting researcher at Lancaster University's Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business, and a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, whose conference I think I spoke at 3 or 4 years ago and had a lovely time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing these perspectives again. Over to you, Nadine.
So I'm not sure how interactive you're feeling, but when we face up to the reality of the situation that we're in, these are some of the emotions that we may be encountering. You mentioned shame. Probably we could add a lot more to this as well. Possibly, we might also be having some of these emotions. Excitement, you refer to. But in some ways, it doesn't really make... What's less important is the particular emotions that we're feeling, because probably all of us, at one time or another, are feeling all of these. Often we're feeling conflicting emotions at the same time. I know I do. There'll be layers of emotions, and depending on how deep we dig, we may discover more and more. But what's more important is how we deal with these emotions, and how we negotiate the tensions and the inner conflicts that will be arising within us when we contemplate everything to do with climate change. So how we deal with these emotions shapes our responses, and it determines to a very large extent whether those responses are adaptive or maladaptive. So climate change, ecological crisis, poses psychological threat on these various different dimensions: existential, identity, self-esteem, as well as threatening our life plans, our ideas about what our lives are going to be like in the future. It challenges who we think we are, as individuals and as a society. And it also challenges our sense of worthiness as moral beings. This is where emotions of guilt and shame can come in. Now, although I understand why the term climate emergency is being used and climate crisis, and I at times use these terms myself, I'm also, I draw a lot on cognitive linguistics in my work. And one of the things about the term emergency is normally when we think of emergencies or crises, they're fairly immediate, short-term events. And of course, what we're dealing with is the long emergency, something that's happening over decades. So that emergency is, not, you know, if you think about a house on fire, where it tends to be dealt with in a kind of command and control response, okay? And I think that there's potential with this frame of climate emergency to invite in anti-democratic governance and strengthen oppressive regimes. In an emergency or a crisis situation, people tend not to be sitting around doing processes of deliberative democracy. So I'm just putting that out there. So psychological threat. So when we perceive a threat, this causes disequilibrium in the body, and that creates stress. And humans tend to want to alleviate stress and to decrease the negative emotions that come with stress as quickly as possible, so that we can go back to baseline functioning as quickly as possible. And and we do that. We try to alleviate stress through a number of different types of defense mechanisms and coping strategies, and these processes tend to play out in below the level of our conscious awareness. Oops. So now these defenses and coping strategies have emotional, cognitive, behavioral components to them. But the outcomes can be adaptive on an ecological level or maladaptive, as well as personally adaptive or maladaptive. There's all kinds of contextual forces that influence, you know, which coping strategies and defenses we might have a preference for, how they get played out, because these are not just individual, they also play out at the level of our culture as well. I don't have time to kind of go into all of that, but here is a whole list of types of coping strategies. People tend to talk mostly about denial, but denial is just one of many. Actually, disavowal is a lot more common, where we both accept and reject at the same time, simultaneously. So with all of these, what do these do? Well, these serve a function, okay? So they defend against feeling. They protect us from taking responsibility and having to take significant action. Some of them enhance our self-esteem, which, as I showed in the previous slide, might have been challenged by climate change and ecological destruction. It protects our sense of self. In terms of the diversionary activity, this can help to mollify feelings of guilt. It's a form of absolution, defends against feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, and it reasserts our sense of being in control. So we can see how attractive these kind of coping strategies can be to us. So in terms of adaptive coping strategies, So what these do is help us adjust to the reality of this situation, and it stimulates appropriate and proportional responses. And what I want to particularly focus on is emotion regulation. So coming back to these difficult emotions. So the question is, are we able to be with these feelings and engage with them? Because so often these will be called negative emotions, but in climate psychology we prefer to talk about them as difficult emotions because emotions have a purpose. I mean, they exist for a reason. They're not an evolutionary mistake. Emotions are cues, so they direct our attention and they guide our behavior. And so what happens if we don't engage with these powerful emotions? In my own research, which I did, my PhD research, and this has been found in other studies, people have a tendency to want to suppress these difficult emotions, to kind of rush into positive emotions. And but suppressed feelings don't just go away. They actually just kind of steer us from behind and affect what we're doing in ways which we're not often aware. And they can re-emerge into our consciousness with more intensity. Suppression of emotion takes effort. It's physically and mentally tiring. And also it diverts cognitive resources away from other tasks. In the short term, suppressing these kinds of emotions might be adaptive on a personal level, depending on the context that you're in. It might be that you're in a situation where it's not safe to express some of these emotions. But over the longer term, there's a huge amount of studies which show that suppression of strong emotion over the long term is pathological, basically, and it's associated with poor mental health. So are we able to honor these emotions and regulate them, or are we at their mercy, unconsciously reacting in ways that are unhealthy and unhelpful? And what I'm particularly interested in is this idea that we don't really have the social norms in this country for expressing how we feel about climate change and ecological destruction. And this is what we need, I think. We need this some kind of container that can hold this, and where we can express it and work with them and work through them and use these emotions creatively, and also to be able to acknowledge the ethical conflicts and tensions that we feel within us, because I doubt very much that there's anyone who doesn't feel conflicts and tensions. It's kind of also part of what it means to be human. And acknowledging that we feel these ethical dilemmas is part of the honesty which I think Greenhouse is calling for in this thing about honest politics. And so if we have a kind of social structure that can hold this, we can bring stuff that's maybe been suppressed, and we can bring it into awareness, and that's kind of where we can work with them. So as I said, all of us face ethical dilemmas and experience conflicting emotions. All of us, to some extent, at certain moments, are in disavowal, unconsciously defending ourselves against the pain and the horror. None of us are completely right or completely wrong in the way that we are responding. And the humility that comes with a realization like that can help us relate to one another with more compassion and forgiveness. Another thing which I think is that there is a need for not just individual, but also some sort of public or collective mourning for loss in all of its various forms, loss of wildlife, loss of sense of safety and security, of our comfortable lifestyles, expectations of the future. Because with mourning, we can actually let go of these things which are being lost or that we're in the process of losing. We can let go of all the things which are no longer serving us and the other beings with which we live on with this planet. And with letting go, we can create space for the new, for better ways of living, for some of the things which Natalie was referring to in the beginning. Not just with each other as humans, but with all the other species as well. So, and now to my final point, which is about psychological resources to help build resilience and support positive change. See, this uplifting music on cue. Yeah. When you're ready. Yeah. So yes, psychological resources to help build resilience and support positive change at individual, community and societal levels. Now we need these resources to help us deal with the trauma that is coming. And of course for some people that trauma is very much already here. A key element of these resources is hope, radical hope, which comes from being able to face the worst and which is directed towards, as Jonathan Lear says, a positive goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is. Such a hope is not just about determination and courage, but also about love and a refinding of all that is benign in the world. But my view, and that's which is shared by many in the Climate Psychology Alliance, is that we can't really get to that until we also properly engage with and work through the difficult emotions as well. And so this event today is quite focused on solutions, and my invitation to you is to just attend to how you're feeling today, to keep checked in with your emotions, and for all of us to as we go forth is just to be noticing whether we're falling into some of these maladaptive coping strategies, and then we've got choice about what we do. We can continue with it or we can choose to do something else. And just to end this presentation, I'd like to invite you to do just a short 3-minute meditation. It's up to you if you take part or not. You don't have to. But it's just something to kind of check ourselves in for the day. Maybe there'll be opportunity to do it towards the end of the event as well. So if you do wish to do this, then you don't need to change how you're sitting. However you're sitting is fine. You can shut your eyes if you wish, but it doesn't matter. And the idea of this meditation is we follow loosely a kind of a broad focusing of awareness and then a narrow, and then it broadens back out again. So the first step is just to check in with yourself right now and just be noticing what thoughts are passing through your mind from everything that you've heard already this morning, the conversations that you've had, whatever thoughts about the climate emergency that you're bringing with you. So simply noticing the thoughts that are here, if any, and labeling them, maybe worry or plan, memory, judgment. And just noticing what feelings are here for you in this moment. Just simply noticing, just accepting whatever is here is what is here. And noticing any physical sensations in the body. Noticing what's happening with the heart, with your breathing. Maybe parts of the body where there's tension, resistance. So simply accepting that whatever is going on for you right now is the reality of your situation in this moment. And now shifting the focus to the breath. So just noticing breath coming in through the nose, down the throat, into the chest, and back out again. Just following each breath in and each breath out in turn. Breathing in and breathing out. And if you like, putting a hand on the belly and just allowing your focus to settle on the feeling of the breath in the belly. Noticing the rise and fall, expansion and contraction. And for the third step, as you breathe in, just having a sense of breathing into the whole of the body. So the oxygen is reaching every cell, all the way down to your toes, your fingertips, top of your head. And as you breathe out, you're breathing out from the whole body. And having this sense of connection with the world outside. Breathing in, oxygen has been released by plants. Breathing out, carbon dioxide, part of which might be going up into the atmosphere. And bringing your focus to the contact that you're making with the chair, the ground, the shape that your body is in, the amount of space that you're taking up, a sense of the other people and things around you in the room, outside the room. So just bringing your awareness back out into the world and coming to open your eyes when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Nadine. I think that was very powerful, some great thoughts, and a really interesting experience. Anyone who's still holding their breath because of the carbon dioxide, you can stop holding your breath now. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes for questions to either of our speakers. The usual strictures about short questions would be enormously appreciated and maybe cut off if they're not. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to put to Andrew or Nadine out there, I'm sure there will be some. Raise your hand in the normal manner. Right here in the middle. Do we have a roving? Yes, there's a roving mic coming from behind you. Yep.
It's a question about the Green Deal. I guess if there is an introduction of a Green Deal, there'll be winners and losers in the economy. I mean, if you were a producer in, I can't remember what you called it now, boutique vegetables in Africa, and your product suddenly isn't being bought because we're buying locally, how would you, the losers of the Green Deal, how would you ameliorate those effects?
It's kind of a really simple question, which is really an epic question about the whole of economics, about how do you design an economy in which everybody gets to benefit? We already exist in a system in which there are many winners and losers, and the global trading scheme as it stands at the moment is not exactly a paragon of social justice, equity and equal distribution, so there are changes that need to happen anyway. The other thing, of course, is that the economy is always dynamic. There are industries and sectors rising and falling all the time, and our challenge is always how you can guarantee the most just transition from one state to another. Now, one of the good things about the Green New Deal is that it addresses this explicitly. It looks at the areas, and in fact, many of the areas for intervention are those areas, the post-industrial areas, which are suffering most at the moment anyway. Now, that's not to gloss over the fact that in going through a shift away from the energy-intensive industries to a more circular economy and a green economy, that you need to manage that. But that's the point about the Green New Deal. It says, let's consciously take control of this situation, understand that we have to make this change. It's kind of some aspects of it are non-negotiable, and let's do it justly. And I think wherever you see people talking about the Green New Deal, whether it's in North America or in mainland Europe or here, you see people addressing exactly that, how to identify where people need help, where regions need help, where the vulnerable sectors are, and that you intervene with that in mind.
Okay, another question there in the middle, so perhaps if you can pass the microphone over. Might need to be easier to pass the microphone over.
Nadine, I have a question for you. Just earlier this week, I invited a couple of secondary school students to come and speak at our town, Tunbridge Wells, from Tunbridge Wells Town Forum. And the main question to them was, how do you feel about climate change? And none of them answered the question because they didn't express their feelings. They did talk a lot about practical things and things they'd learned in school and all that sort of stuff. But how can we, because we're thinking about setting up some youth forum for climate action, and how would you propose, or have you got any ideas on how we can create a safe space for them where they can actually incorporate their feelings? And talk
I mean,
about
what you're describing there is intellectualization. People ask us how you feel and you respond with what you think. You kind of do it all the time. I mean, well, there's loads of, I mean, it's a massive question that you're asking. There are quite a lot of resources. The Climate Psychology Alliance has got a load of resources, so I would definitely direct you there first. And because you're right, there does need to be, it does need to be handled carefully as well. And when people start to kind of open up, that there is a process that you can take people through. So they're not just sort of left, there. But is that okay for now? It's yeah. We could talk more in the lunch or something if you like.
Hi there, yeah, my name's John Taylor. Really enjoyed what you've all been saying so far, and I agree with the point that, today the way we live now isn't as good as it gets, and we need to get better at telling that story of the better future that we can all inspire and sustain people to work towards. I like the science and the data, but I know that doesn't connect with people, and it's stories and emotion that do. So I was wondering if you three personally have a story that you personally motivates and inspires you.
That's a really nice question, and I'm going to slightly cheat, and in my answer I'm going to also respond to something that Nadine teed up, which I thought was it's a really interesting thing, about this distinction between, and when we talk about emergencies, that the difference being now that we're living through a long emergency, and the question of whether this is something entirely new to us that we have to negotiate. So the story which inspires me, which also speaks to this slightly, is that just under 20 years ago, I used to work with a group called the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And in terms of triggering potentially maladaptive responses, they had a wonderful annual publication called the World Disasters Report. Wasn't that cheery? And I worked on it for a few years, and in one of the years I worked on it, I looked specifically and actually traveled to spend some time with communities in the South Pacific. Because in terms of living the long emergency and the kind of extremes that we are going to encounter more of in circumstances of climate breakdown, of course, these have been circumstances that vulnerable communities in many places around the world have been living with for a very long period of time. Now, what was really interesting about that is there's an awful lot of learning out there already. People have been doing kind of on-the-ground community development work for many, many years. And there's a sort of a cycle which in that community where they talk about disaster preparedness, where, for example, in one of the communities I went to visit, they did a process of participatory vulnerability assessment, which sounds really kind of fancy, but basically they kind of sat down with a really big sheet of paper, drew a picture of their local community and said, who do we know in our community who is vulnerable? Where do they live? And they'd mark the houses, and where are the problems of danger? And say, well, we know that when we get flooding, that if you walk through this field, if it's flooded, the snakes are going to be escaping in this direction, so you don't want to go through there because you might get bitten by a snake. So they did all that. And they also work up their sort of post-disaster reconstruction techniques. Now, the interesting thing is that it's never the state who's the first responder in these situations. It's always the community. And the other interesting thing about many of these communities, especially the small island states, is that their economies have evolved over time to be quite collaborative, based upon gift giving and share economies. And this washes through in some very interesting ways. At the New Economics Foundation, we did a report called the Happy Planet Index, which measured your life satisfaction, life expectancy against your ecological footprint. And one of the unpredictable things which came out of doing that piece of research was that small island states came out as at the top of the Happy Planet Index in all the global regions. And we might speculate that they have learned to live together with a more acute understanding of environmental limits and have developed ways of dealing with the long emergency over time. So I think there's an interesting literature there to look into. So my encounter with that community is what gives me hope that we can develop ways to deal with the long emergency.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to make noises with this. Was it stories that inspire? Did you say? Or fiction or a film or anything? Well, I'm going to answer it slightly differently. But so I live in Scotland, and so there was a survey that was done in March, I think. It was a YouGov survey. It was commissioned by Stop Climate Chaos. But one of the findings really interested me, and it was so that they were asking people, do you feel more concerned than a year ago or whatever, right? And then of people who said that they were concerned or more concerned or whatever, it was what's your main reason, right? And one of the top reasons was to do with loss of wildlife, and so women were more likely than men to do that, but also younger people, and I just thought that was really interesting, because it's the bit which touches me the most as well. And I remember growing up in Edinburgh, and I used to really love the sound of the swifts in the summer, with the long summer nights in Scotland. And I was so looking forward, after living away for 30 years, and then came back just over a year ago, and the swifts are virtually gone. And so I really noticed that. And but I also teach mindfulness and nature connection, and what I notice is that there's this yearning from people to connect, and maybe they hadn't been brought up with it, but people really seem to need this, right? And I really enjoy teaching it, and that because the more that we notice what's going on with our wildlife, the more we're able to respond in a way that's appropriate. But that's where I get inspiration from, is just noticing this, how people seem to be really wanting it and needing it.
Well, my short story fits very well with that, in terms of this is a true story. Many years ago, as a young journalist in Australia, I'd done an agricultural science degree, and I'd been taught soil science as a chemistry subject. You poured a certain amount of K and various chemicals into the soil. You saw how much they'd been depleted at the end of the year and poured some more chemicals in. That was how I was taught at Australia's premier university, soil science. And one of the reasons why I didn't pursue soil science then was because I had an awareness that basically Australian agriculture wasn't farming the soils, it was mining them. And it didn't make sense, but nothing I'd been taught suggested there was any other way forward. And just purely coincidentally, as a young journalist, because that's what I'd gone into, I went and visited a biodynamic farm. Now, I'm not entirely sold on all aspects of biodynamic philosophy, I will confess, but I was utterly bowled over by the fact this was in the middle of an Australian summer. The farmer took me into the middle of his wheat field and said, "Oh, look at my soil." And he had a shovel on his shoulder, and he just turned the shovel over, put it down on the soil, and just casually leant on it. Now, your average Australian wheat field in the middle of summer, you'd need a very strong person with a pickaxe to make any kind of impact at all. But this shovel just slid down through the soil, and he turned it over, and it was teeming with earthworms, teeming with organic matter. And I just looked at it and thought, that's not what soil looks like. I've never seen soil like that before. And again, this is a story of hope, because what really inspires me is actually how incredibly resilient nature is. how much nature can rebound from some of the most terrible abuses like we've done to our soils. Give a soil 2 or 3 years of good treatment and it rebounds amazingly. And, you know, I have an actual case study of this in my back garden in Sheffield because you could say I've got a systematic rewilding project in my back garden. That would be one way of putting it. And I do put some inputs in that I put vast amounts of bird feed out. But I've gone from 3 sparrows to something well over 20 to the uncountable level of sparrows in 2.5, 3 years. So just create that little bit of space of opportunity, and nature can do just absolutely so much. And that's something that I think can inspire us and give us hope and see what's possible. On which light, I think, I'm sorry, I know there were more questions, but I think we're out of time. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have explanation of what comes next in a second. But first of all, I'd like to ask everyone to thank our 2 speakers for what I think was a great start to the morning. Thank you.